Yeah, I guess it's a hugely rewarding giving back, and it does make a difference. And I think if people are in that boat of, we've spoken about this briefly here, but I want to get into cybersecurity, I don't know how, this is a great place to do that, these sorts of things that we're running. But like you say, if you're getting a lot of resistance in your own mind from what you're coming up against, maybe that factor is it for you. Or maybe is there a different part of cybersecurity you can look at?
Yeah.
It's not all the same, maybe,
Well, you said something interesting, the expression pay it back, and I hear people say pay it forward and getting people into cyber. I'm not here to do any of those things. I'm not here to get people into cyber. I'm here to get people what they want. And to get what they want, they have to understand what they want. They have to know what they want. And that's a continual process we all go through. We never stop doing it. Requirements. Requirements is the thing. In recruiting and staffing, requirements, that's the hardest part most of the time. Like, okay, client, what do you want? I need an AWS guy. I'm like, more, please. Why do you need an AWS guy? When do you need them? What's the business driver behind this? Is that deal really going to happen? Why, all these questions about requirements that we struggle to elicit from clients. Candidates are going through the same thing, right? And we sit at the intersection between one set of confused people and another set of confused people, and wait for them to sort it out. And sometimes I just feel like I'm the requirements whisperer. I'm just trying to figure out what people really want. And my business hacking takes the form of, I got one problem, I have another problem. If I combine those problems, there's a solution inherent in that combination, the fusion of those two things. And if the solution to the candidate's problem is stop pursuing a cyber career, great. If the solution to the client's problem is don't try and solve that with people, get better tech or get a better business process in place. If I can solve it that way and get it off my plate, right, and see to their needs, great. It's honest is all it is. And I'm not paying it forward and I'm not paying it back, because I get paid right now every day by seeing people start to make their way toward what they really want, what's going to be good for themselves, their families, their communities. That's it.
I'd say last sort of 5 years or so, it seems to have really gained traction, and some of the stuff you've touched on already has been brought to light. But what's your sort of view on the OT security landscape at the moment? Very broad question, I know, but like I said, there seems to be more of a light shone on things at the minute.
Yeah, so I'm intrigued by your assessment that way. I mean, the threat environment has changed quite dramatically in the last 5 years, but that's not something a lot of people know about. So I'd be interested to understand where you're getting your information from. But to answer your question, it depends. It depends on the jurisdiction. North America, it tends to be more regulated. Israel and the Middle East generally is more regulated. Regulations are coming in Europe. NIST, the NIST 2 standard is coming. So, in jurisdictions where there's more regulation, generally of critical infrastructures, you tend to see a greater awareness, a greater investment, and greater results, better security. In jurisdictions or even entire industries where there aren't regulations. I mean, there's no regulations for, small toaster factories, other than safety regulations. There's no cyber regulations that apply to small toaster factories. So it depends on the industry. I will, to give you a nugget, I will say, look, I am personally concerned about OT security in small water treatment systems all over the world. Again, there tend not to be regulations in that space. And in my opinion, a small water treatment system is every bit as much critical infrastructure as the largest water treatment systems. The largest systems have budget, they have cybersecurity, hopefully they're doing good things. The ones we work with obviously are doing good things. The smallest, I mean, imagine a municipality was recently breached. The 180 households had no water for 2 days in, I think it was Ireland, like 2 weeks ago. Why? Because all the utility had was 180 customers. How much do they pay for water and sewage together? Maybe $1,000 a year. We're talking $250,000 a year budget for the whole thing, most of which is spent on people with trucks and backhoes, digging holes in the ground, patching leaks, or laying new pipe. Do they have automation? Yes. Do they have an IT person on staff? Probably not. $250,000 a year budget? Forget it. Do they have an engineer on staff? Forget it. Yet they're exposed to cyber attack. These small systems are important and exposed. And so I worry about some industries, especially on the small side, especially on the unregulated side, where there are still serious potential consequences.
Thank you for that. So I guess kicking it all off, in what sense do you class yourself as neurodivergent?
So, neurodivergent is the combination of a lot of different traits that used to be defined separately. It was originally, people talked about autism and ADHD, someone as personality disorders, and not that just the brain works differently, because we didn't understand that. In fact, autism is very new. I mean, the first person diagnosed with autism just died this year at 89 years old. So he was diagnosed in the 40s. And so this is something that is relatively novel. And they realized that the brain has, autistic people, has more connections going on than the average bear. And that may also include things like ADHD, dyslexia, OCD, including things like Tourette's. Neurodiversity covers all of these different things. And in fact, the classification of autism has kind of been upgraded to ASC, autism spectrum condition, because it includes things that we used to separate it by Asperger's and autism and things like that. And so this as a category is something that when I started looking into it, and frankly, just doing crowdsourcing on social media, TikTok, there's autism TikTok, there's ADHD reels of people sharing their experience. And it's a great way to get a lot of information. And of course, you have to manage what's accurate, what's not accurate, what's biased, what's not biased. I'm looking at them saying, I don't know anyone who's not this way. What are you talking about? Then when I started looking back and saying, oh, I recognize the different traits about myself. And so there are things that were previously considered, mental or behavior disorders, and something that psychiatrists were trying to, train out of you or help you with, or more likely trying to medicate you out of, where it's actually something that your brain works this way. Don't fight it. Try to go with it and see how to best leverage that.
So incident response, then it's a growing industry. We know that it's really in demand at the moment. There's a lot of organizations getting involved in this now. And then I think the SEC changes came into effect in December. So these changes have somewhat influenced the incident response space, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I actually wrote a blog post about this if you want to go read about it on the CyberCX blog. So the TLDR version of this is basically that the SEC says unless there's a material impact to national security or threat to life and limb, you have 4 days to report an incident once materiality has been determined. And so then the question is, okay, well, what's materiality? Because if you look at the 8K filing from, MGM, for example, after their breach, I think they estimated it was something like $110 million was going to be the impact, and they didn't determine that to be material. And so what's material to MGM might not be, or is not material to MGM, is material to, Billy Bob's Barbecue or, whatever. And so you can look to the Supreme Court, right? So there's a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court. The exact, citation is in my blog post, but it basically says, look, if a reasonable shareholder would view this information as pertinent to the decision-making process to buy or sell, it is then determined to be material, which again, sort of nebulous, but much more descriptive than just simply everyone applying their own lens of what materiality is. And so once that's
homework,
exactly. And exactly. Exactly. Right. So once you determine materiality, you have 4 days to report, unless you're working with some law enforcement agency because there's a nexus to national security or threat to life and limb. But what you also have to report then is the status of your cybersecurity posture, and that's really where organizations are starting to get hung up, is they have to disclose this now, and what is going to be considered, quote unquote, reasonable, right? In the legal ecosystem, this is called a defensible position of reasonableness, right? And so one of my side hustles is I'm an expert witness, both at the state and federal level. And so I get to go to court and argue these sorts of things to determine, is the actions that this individual took or this security team took deemed to be reasonable? And there's a lot of opinion and speculation in that. And so it's kind of the battle of the experts in the courtroom. But the SEC ruling should really put everyone on notice that you can't not report now, especially if you're a publicly traded entity. But this also filters down to non-public companies. So it's a much broader application, because if you are a non-public entity doing business with a publicly traded company, you now fall under a whole litany of auspices that are defined by the SEC. Also, there was a precedent set last year where an organization, and this is in my blog post as well, but an organization violated the Dodd-Frank whistleblower program that the SEC deemed to be appropriate for, organizations or people that want to blow the whistle. And because they violated that, the SEC fined them $250,000 or something like that, but they're not a publicly traded company. They just violated an SEC ruling. And so what everyone's kind of holding their breath wondering is, how broad is the SEC going to apply this rule? Is it just going to be publicly traded companies? Is it privately held companies that do business with publicly traded companies? Or is it going to be everybody?
I see. And so on this whole sort of topic, I guess, of doing more with less, if you sort of, in a way, ignore the industries that are a bit more mature, a bit further down the line, maybe through having bigger budgets or being regulated more heavily for many years. I'm thinking of those industries that are maybe smaller manufacturing organizations. Water wastage gets a lot of attention at the moment. Doing more with less, it can come down to things such as awareness and configurations, which, I'm not the purse string holders for those organizations, but that sounds a lot less expensive and needing maybe less buy-in and maybe getting whole new systems and technologies and everything else in play.
Yeah, I constantly kind of hear that either or discussion. Do we invest in more security, or do we invest in newer technology and kind of hope that it's more secure by design? And it really shouldn't be an either or consideration. We've continued to say cybersecurity supports the business. And sometimes we forget that, but it does. It's a function of the organization that should support the overall mission and function of the business, not just, its own island. But that said, the considerations for technologies, security should be a part of the conversation every time. Security should be a part of the conversation at the board level, regardless of the size, right? Or at the top leadership level, regardless of the size of the business. We don't want to see bolt-on security, and we don't want to see assumptions. And the real problem with this is that when we get down to contracts, there's always those race to the bottom in terms of what's most affordable historically. That's changing a little bit. And these RFPs, these requests for proposals, typically don't include security. So unless it's a enforced compliance measure, it's ignored a lot of the time. And we're starting to see that change, because now people are evaluating the cost of ransomware. They're evaluating the losses from security, the production value, the mean time to recover these processes, and understanding that security needs to be part of the conversation from the get-go. And this kind of last 10-year obsession with centralization of data doesn't help us from a security standpoint. It actually could be a critical failure, right? So that those conversations are also ongoing, and it's been really beneficial to see everyone aware that, a data lake isn't going to fix all your problems. And, also having all of your data in one place without the proper analysis tools and understanding of bespoke technologies, like when we talk about, PLCs and SCADA technology, the protocols are all mainstream, I would say. So they're not protocols that most IT analysts or even not regular, but either cybersecurity experts have been indoctrinated into. So it's a learning curve. But those learning curves, there's people, that the awareness is growing. So people are obsessed with this space, and I'm one of those people. And I think, we're only going to continue to benefit it and stay ahead of, potentially catastrophic incidents.
Like you say, there's so many specialized areas within that. I mean, you mentioned earlier on this call here that we can sort of group it under the OT, IoT, security, IIoT,
Yeah, exactly.
ICS. There's a few terminologies that, although are different in their own right, do interlink. So just, I guess, on that at the moment, what are you seeing as the sort of the overall state of the OT security space at the moment?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, before going into that, I just want to make a plug for anybody that is looking to go into OT security. It may seem almost impossible to break into that field, cybersecurity in the first place, but OT security maybe even more so. Just wanted to throw a little confidence out there to people and say, if it's something you're trying to pursue, and it's a phenomenal field and a phenomenal community that I'm happy to talk about in a second, and that overall threat landscape, James. But people can also start in the IT realm and pivot to OT, or you can go work at an asset owner like an oil or a manufacturer or utility that works in IT and then move in, or maybe even become a control engineer and pivot that point, right? Even if you have to take a step back to make a couple steps forward in the future, it's worth every second, because I can personally say I love and I'm very passionate about what I do. And every person I've met in the community also feels the same. So a little plug for anybody out there that's trying to work with great guys like James and the rest of his team, and to make that magic happen.
Have you got maybe an example or two where they've gone through that whole process, they've come out the other side and then gone, you know what, really glad we're now set up for this because we've got a proper system, people, process, technology in place that in theory works towards better cybersecurity for our OT?
Yeah, I mean, this ends up being a bit, philosophical, and I bring this up a lot because the core part of prevention is the core thing that makes a time travel movie exciting. Someone goes back in time and fixes something, and those in the future of that timeline never know they were saved. So the person is a hero, but they're never recognized for being a hero. In fact, they might even be treated like they're crazy. In the case of Sarah Connor in the Terminator 2 or whatever, right? Right, obviously I'm a sci-fi fan, but and that's the problem with prevention in general, or infrastructure in general. I mean, every politician struggles with this. Spending money on infrastructure is just not sexy. It's absolutely required, but it's not sexy. And I worked in infrastructure most of my career. So you start to go, internally, we have had a lot of feedback. Wow, I'm really glad we did this. Or wow, this is really, sometimes someone will say, this is what I was talking about. I was hoping we would do a long time ago. Right. But there is the risk of, Y2K is a good example, right? How many people, when Y2K happened, when it was over and nothing happened, said, what a bust. Oh, what a scam. They all got us all revved up for nothing. And I'm like, no, we spent billions of dollars fixing it.
Yes.
And then we didn't have any problems, and then acting like, so it's the same problem, right? And don't get me wrong, there were tons of contractors who just made money off of Y2K and were scamming people there. That happened. But I would bet it's in the realm of 5% of the projects that were done were frivolous money, guys just grabbing money. But for the most part, people who quote things want to fix things. And yes, as a company, we pride ourselves on that, as trying to build an engagement especially as a contractor. If you're getting a contract with a client where every year they feel like, all right, that engagement was worth it. Not like, now that you guys got used, this is a classic consulting problem, right? At some point your problem becomes the consultants, right? There's too many consultants who are trying to advise. So
Indeed.
yeah, so trying to keep your tools sharp and your team sharp, and occasionally there will be times where you kind of go, look, no team can execute 100% of the time. But the ideal is to constantly get your team back on track when maybe they missed the plot for a minute, right? Or the client's needs have shifted or changed, and how do we make sure that we can keep them happy, right?
You're the one OT security person there. 90 days, or the low-hanging fruit. What would you tackle first to get that secure environment?
Yeah, certainly. So if you're the head or owning all of the OT cybersecurity risk of your organization, I suggest you do a few things. A lot of my suggestions will be corresponding to, the fact that maybe you don't have enough budget to go out and get a consultant to do it, or purchase a technology to assess your own risk. My first suggestion is building out a matrix, utilizing your favorite flavor of cybersecurity framework. Mm-hmm. The one I like the most is the NIST cybersecurity framework, just because it's applicable to almost all industries, if not all industries. So you have your identify, detect, protect, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Take a snapshot or understand all your security controls, or vendors, compensating controls that you have in place, and put them inside your matrix and really identify where your gaps are. You might have stuff to protect. You might have firewalls in place, maybe firewalls in place in multiple levels where you're creating that segmentation. But if you don't have anything to detect a threat that gets by there, that's a gap. Afterwards, you want to be able to figure out your perimeter, the perimeter of the OT network. So that perimeter are those firewalls. So if you have a lack of firewalls, AKA maybe you don't have enough, maybe you only have one firewall between the IT OT network. Well, you want to analyze those firewall rules, make sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be. There are some cost-effective solutions out there to do that if you don't want to, read firewall configurations.
Okay,
and then you want to kind of build a plan, right? All right, so I have this one firewall and it's protecting, let's say, 4 networks. How do I then figure out a way to segment that? You can try to do a proof of concept, a proof of value with a cybersecurity company vendor, maybe implement something to detect if that is more cost effective than implementing more firewalls. But I suggest building this tier layer. I keep going back to defensible architecture, where the goal is to stop, slow down, or detect the threat. And the more layers you put, and then let me tell you, as an red teamer, the more layers you put, the more frustrated I definitely get, because it's hard for me to get to my goal because I'm flying in blind. There's an old adage that I don't know if you've heard, where the defenders always say, well, the attacker only needs to get the answer right once. They only need to find one vulnerability or one password that works. But what they don't understand sometimes is once they're in the network, once the attacker is in the network, they have to be perfect.
Okay.
They can't be making mistakes, because if they make a mistake and they don't understand the entirety of your environment that you understand, it could be very easy to identify them and stop them and contain them, at least. So our goal as defenders is to make it as hard as possible for them to go within the network, because they're going to end up making a mistake, and then we can capitalize on that.
If we can take the sort of the power dynamic between the CISO and the CIO, what are you seeing there at the moment?
I think I've seen that evolve as well in my years in the industry. I think, a lot of times some organizations can't afford to have a CISO. So you might have like a director of information security. Yeah. So it's technically the CISO, but in large, publicly traded companies, I think the CISO, unfortunately, a lot of times is siloed inside the CIO's organization, which, may not be the best alignment, at least from my perspective, because there's a challenge in terms of, the investments that the CISO thinks are necessary, and investment in controls that, are needed to protect the environment, where the CIO has that much broader look and has that, limited finite budget, where they're trying to, please end using computing. They've got to do, all these regulatory things. But, I think where I've seen it successful is when a CISO gains the trust of CIO and, says, these are the things that we really should be focusing on. I remember a time when, the concept of investing in distributed denial of service technology, prevention was like, no, that's never going to happen, right? But it started happening, and then all of a sudden, every CIO is like, going and arguing that they need to, increase their budget to, deploy this technology. So it evolves over time, but I think there's that delicate balance, right? Because at the end of the day, the CIO has much broader responsibilities. Obviously security is key, and one of the key components, but, making sure people can use their, laptops and their, their phones, and just from a pure functionality perspective, right? My password doesn't work, or, like this, all those things helped us, you never really kind of think about the nuances of what, a CIO has to be responsible for. That, you add that to business applications and their responsibility around that, and investments, and making sure that, third-party vendor risk management is like solid, right? That's I think it will evolve over time, but also I've seen CISOs, have been pulled out of the traditional technology organization and placed in kind of what I would traditionally call like a second line of defense role, like in the chief risk officer's organization. But that's like very sophisticated clients, that are heavy regulated, like banking industry. And so that gives, I think, the CISO some level of independence, and so they can work together with the CIO as opposed to being kind of subordinate to a.
If you take something, the regulations are asking for real-time monitoring, for example, this is that's not a quick fix type thing. It's not sort of just like you say, we can just do a SaaS deployed patch overnight and it's all done. So it seems to be that if you take people, process, technology to change things, it sounds like the technology that's out now could really help comply with these maritime and OT regulations that are coming in.
Absolutely. And it's calling for technology. They actually pretty much say it, out loud. The idea is, you mentioned the people, process, technology. I think, first of all, what's really important is that the shipping companies change the mindset.
Yeah.
One of the things is that they need to start manage, and they have the management, the executives have a personal liability here. They need to understand that they're managing cyber programs. So it's not something that, my IT manager is handling it. So one thing is changing the mindset, be able to create a culture in the company that cybersecurity not built inside the design of the ship itself, but built inside the design of the company. Educate the people, be able to run risk management programs, track them, measure them. This is something that technology helps. Because otherwise, and of course, because you have so many new threats, you need to do prioritization. You need to work into what we call it transition from managing the devices to managing the threats, right? Some things you can't control, but you can control what are the threats, what are the vulnerabilities that you have, map them out, get the technology that can automate. This is exactly why we built Cyber, to be able to detect maritime technologies, maritime equipment, map them out, help adopt a cyber risk approach to assessing risk for each and every device. And now you get 2,000 alerts. So what do I do with this? How do I prioritize that? How do I build a plan for improvement? How do I assess the impact? How do I, sometimes if there's an OT device that I cannot replace, there are other things that I can do to mitigate that risk. Whether it's network segregation, whether it's other, like changing the rules in my monitoring, whatever. But build a holistic system around it, and as in every program, you need to start it from the top, from the top executives, that they need to start adopting. So another thing that the technology can help, in addition, of course, to the protection itself, is give the IT manager or the cybersecurity managers of shipping companies the tools to bring cybersecurity as something that the management can review. And that's not a firewall. This is not the traditional cybersecurity tools. You need to bring something that they can take to their CEO and say, look, this is where we are. This is the budget I need. Here's how we're going to track changes, because eventually you're responsible for this. And here are the tests that we need to do if we're building a new ship. Here are the programs that we need to adopt if this is an old ship, and so forth. And build it into a culture that you can share with the CEO, with the head of operations, a training program for the staff, for the crew, and so on.
We run some programs before with some large organizations where, they were looking to hire externally, where we sort of pointed them back internally again to other teams or functions where with some training, and as long as the individuals are prepared to undertake that training,
Yes.
it's more cost effective to do it that way, as long as they're willing to sort of jump on those transferable skills. And then it's a bit of a win-win. It's a win-win because people are entering into a new, exciting industry. They're learning new skill sets, but the organization's keeping hold of people that perhaps may have come to a dead end and then looked external.
Yeah. Well, and
the cost of
it's the quality. It's the we can teach you cyber, we can teach you technology.
Yeah.
But it's the qualities that people bring that, hey, I'm interested in what you're doing. I want to learn. The biggest thing that, going into cyber and into IT in general is, if you're not willing to be a lifelong learner, it's probably not the right role. I look at about 10 news sources a day, looking for what's happening on a macroeconomic and a global standpoint, and how that impacts us from a cyber standpoint. And that's aside from any of the technology stuff that I look at. But it's you have, if your goal in life is, I finished college and now I'm done learning, it's definitely the wrong place, because you will, every day you're learning. And you have to.
Yeah, so. It's a great industry, ever growing, ever changing. And most of the people that we speak to, when they start looking to change jobs, is because they want something different, they want something to learn, and cybersecurity, information security gives you that. So it's a great industry to get into. But like you say, as long as you want to keep learning, it's really key.